fossil fuel subsidies are percolating into other sectors, including agriculture.
It's an obvious choice. We have to stop skewing the economy towards fossil fuels.
It's time to stop working against ourselves and phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies and focus on accelerating.
Hi, I'm Boaz Parley. I'm the Campaign and Partnerships Manager at the United Nations Development Programme. Welcome to Dino Talks Episode 2. This episode was recorded before the war in Ukraine began. Our hearts and thoughts are with the people of Ukraine at this very, very terrible time. That war is now continuing into its sixth week. We see the effects of that war everywhere in the world. Price of grain is going up. That's affecting Africa. The price of oil and gas is going up and soaring, and that's affecting what we are talking about directly. The crisis in climate, the climate emergency cannot wait. We cannot wait for other crises to stop. We need to continue the work as other crises appear, and we need to work continuously all the time to try and solve these issues. That's why we decided to go ahead with these programs and have episode 2 be screened, although the crisis is continuing. But we do believe that we cannot stop. We cannot stop to wait. We need to continue. We don't have time, and the work needs to continue on. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you.
So, welcome everybody to the second episode of what we're calling the Dino Talks, which is being produced by We Don't Have Time TV with our partner, the UN Development Programme. I'm Nick Nuttall, and I'm the Strategic Communications Director for We Don't Have Time, and I'll be joined later by my colleague, my co-host, Boaz Parley, who is based with the UN Development Programme, and he's a Global Partnerships and Campaigns Manager and a former TV journalist.
You okay? You need a minute? Cool. Okay. Listen up, people. I know a thing or two about extinction. And let me tell you, and you'd kind of think this would be obvious, going extinct is a bad thing. And driving yourselves extinct? In 70 million years, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. At least we had an asteroid. What's your excuse? You're headed for a climate disaster, and yet every year governments spend hundreds of billions of public funds on fossil fuel subsidies. Imagine if we had spent hundreds of billions per year subsidizing giant meteors. That's what you're doing right now. Think of all the other things you could do with that money. Around the world, people are living in poverty. Don't you think helping them would make more sense than, I don't know, paying for the demise of your entire species? Let me be real for a second. You've got a huge opportunity right now. As you rebuild your economies and bounce back from this pandemic, this is humanity's big chance. So here's my wild idea. Don't choose extinction. Save your species before it's too late. It's time for you humans to stop making excuses and start making changes. Thank you.
Just before COP26, I think the world suddenly saw a new character, a new figure in the story of climate change and in the story that we're touching on in these series, which is fossil fuel subsidies. We saw Frankie the Dinosaur in the UN General Assembly warning world leaders about the risks of fossil fuel subsidies and asking them, don't choose extinction. We Don't Have Time was broadcasting daily from COP26, and we were supporting this UNDP campaign with Frankie the Dinosaur by having a counter on our stage every night, which was actually counting up the amount of fossil fuel subsidies, or the money that governments were actually paying to subsidize fossil fuels, but also to subsidize, in a sense, damage to our planet. And many of the guests, from policymakers and politicians to scientists, activists, young people, and companies, big and small, looked at that number and they said, this is absolutely crazy. And so it is. Because as we try to decarbonize our world, we try to meet the safety limits of the Paris Climate Change Agreement, we seem to be fighting somewhat with our hands tied behind our backs, because we are subsidizing the very fuels that are at the center of this challenge of dealing with climate change. In our first episode, we looked a little bit at what fossil fuel subsidies are and how much the world is actually spending on this. In the second episode, we're going to take a deeper dive into the area of how this creates tension, of course, with renewable energy, which is the clean fuel that's supposed to actually be moving us towards the goals of the Paris Agreement. But we're also going to look as well at how fossil fuel subsidies could perhaps be better spent on something else that's going to help us with climate change, and that's nature-based solutions. I want to ask all the audience right now if they would download the We Don't Have Time app. That can be done at wedon'thavetime.org, and then you can ask questions from the guests, and also you can engage with the wider We Don't Have Time family with 60,000 organizations and individuals around the world. Let me also at this moment also thank Prime Computer, which is a partner with We Don't Have Time, and they are supporting this 10 series of episodes, the Dino Talks on fossil fuel subsidies. Okay, let's get the show rolling. Let me introduce our first guest, Michael Taylor. Michael Taylor is a senior energy analyst at the International Renewable Energy Agency and responsible for this agency's analysis of renewable energy costs and performance. Prior to working with IRENA, Michael worked for the New Zealand and the UK governments. His recent publications include Renewable Power Generation Costs in 2020 and Energy Subsidies, Evolution in the Global Energy Transformation to 2050. Michael, you have the floor. Give us a perspective on this in terms of the renewable energy and the electrification of transportation story, if possible. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you, Nick. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Although I have to say you've put me in a bit of a spot, Nick. Kind of awkward, actually, because I think from now on, my kids will probably forever associate me as the man whose insights rank 4th or 5th behind the dinosaur. Working with what we can, all levity aside, it's a real pleasure to be here representing the International Renewable Energy Agency and talk about energy sector subsidies, a topic that honestly, as you know, doesn't get the coverage it should. And so I'm very happy to be here and do that. In 2020, you mentioned that we released a report that documented for the first time an estimate of total energy sector subsidies and how they might evolve in the energy transition. The numbers are stark, as I'm sure those who have listened to the first episode have heard. In 2017, we estimated fossil fuels received at least 3.1 trillion in subsidies when you take into account the unpriced negative externalities of fossil fuels. This is 19 times more than was received by renewable energy. So let's talk about those results in a bit of detail. We didn't reinvent the wheel. We looked at fossil fuel subsidy estimates that are already done by the IEA, the OECD, IISD, CAN Europe, and others, and found that the direct subsidies to fossil fuels were 447 billion in 2017. So these are the subsidies through tax exemptions, direct payments to fossil fuel companies, royalty holidays, that kind of thing. Most of that, or around half, I should say, $220 billion US, is for oil products. In total, renewables only received around 166 billion, 128 of that for power generation, and the balance essentially for transportation, conventional biofuels. Nuclear receives at least 20 billion a year, but no really good analysis of the global value exists, so that can only be considered a placemaker. So to these direct subsidies, we need to add the benefit fossil fuels received, as you mentioned in the intro, from these negative externalities. What do we mean by negative externalities? For fossil fuels, these are the climate change damages that they cause from combustion and the increased health costs to society from harmful local pollutant emissions from their combustion. The costs of outdoor air pollution are quite staggering. It's estimated to have been around $2.3 trillion in 2017, with higher values possible given the research continues to highlight more dangerous connections between local pollutant emissions and health outcomes. Climate change, even if you take the lowest value for a social cost of carbon of $11 per ton, still comes to $370 billion extra. So adding all this together, you get this direct value of around $3.1 trillion, acknowledging that the figure can be much higher if you start to look at more reasonable numbers for the climate change damages, as the IMF has done, to estimate 1.7. So by any measure, even the most conservative, the subsidies to renewables in 2017, which are helping to drive the energy transition, are small compared to the benefits extracted by fossil fuels through direct subsidies and the free ride of unpriced externalities, which we all have to pay one way or another. So let's put this into something that's a little bit more understandable, perhaps, for the average person or expert. So let's try and put this disconnect into a price in terms of dollars per ton of carbon, or CO2, sorry. So the direct subsidies of $447 billion in 2017 works out to around a negative CO2 price, so an incentive to consume, as you mentioned earlier, Nick, of $14 per ton. So we're off to a bad start. There's no doubt about it. However, in 2017, there were 45 national and 25 subnational carbon pricing initiatives. So we're clawing a little bit back. Any idea, Nick, if we took all of the revenue from those schemes and divided it by total CO2 emissions from fossil fuels in 2017, any idea how many dollars per ton of CO2 that might claw back?
Oh my God, it's a question now. Heavens above. Let me think. Could it be 5?
Not bad. Not bad. In fact, it's $1 per ton. So we started at minus 14 and we're now at minus 13. So not a great start. The negative health externalities at 2.3 trillion is around $70 a ton. And to make our life easy on the math side, let's just assume a CO2 price of $30 a ton would be reasonable. So we've got 100 from local pollutants and climate change. So, think about that for a moment. We're starting at minus $14 per ton of CO2, so an incentive to consume fossil fuels. We've clawed back 1, so we're at minus 13, but we need to get to 100, right? So it's a mind-bogglingly large disconnect in the price signal for investment in the energy sector. And it's putting at risk, basically, the Paris Agreement goals. And we can come back to this in a minute. But the misallocation of capital implied by this is quite staggering. So let's turn to the analysis that we did do that looked at how fossil fuel subsidies or energy sector subsidies should evolve in the energy transition. Focusing just for the moment on the direct subsidies, our analysis identified 3 key points which I'd like to share, which I think are relevant. First, managed correctly, the energy transition will see lower total energy sector subsidies in 2050 than 2017, or even 2021, but we don't have the exact numbers yet. They could fall by 25% from 634 billion to 475 billion in 2050. The second point is that the reallocation of subsidies away from fossil fuels into renewables is crucial in improving economic efficiency in this capital allocation. Getting this pricing side of it right is crucially important. And the direct subsidies for fossil fuels in our roadmap for the energy transition, which is in the World Energy Technology Outlook, would see direct subsidies to fossil fuels fall from 447 billion to 139 billion in 2050. And 90% of those would be to support CCS and industrial processes where we need to capture essentially process emissions. So it's not to encourage fossil fuel consumption for energy. Finally, within the shift in support to renewables, the focus is going to move through time, right? So we've seen power generation costs come down. They're going to be increasingly contributing a very small amount to subsidy needs going forward, but we need to ramp up our efforts in the end-use sectors sooner rather than later if we're going to achieve the Paris Agreement goals. So what we see is a shift through time within the increased support going into renewables, from power generation today into consecutively buildings, transport, and industry, where we have some very challenging issues for decarbonisation. But the good news in all of this is that we have a template to achieve a cost-effective energy transition, drawn from our understanding of the success that we had with wind, solar and wind power. Investing early in phased support helps to grow manufacturing base, unlock economies of scale, competitive supply chains, drive down costs, and improve technology performance. And it launches a virtuous cycle that repeats. And we can and should replicate this with the solutions needed in the end users, and that's where this investment in learning by doing needs to come. In short, we have more efficient policy tools to address the social and economic goals some fossil fuel subsidies support today, without the negative impacts on increased consumption of fossil fuels. And it's time to stop working against ourselves and phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies and focus on accelerating the energy transition right now. Thank you.
Good, Michael. Thanks a lot. And I mean, it's amazing actually when you think about it that renewable energy is growing. Some say penetrating globally, growing by 3.5 times each year or 4.5 fold each year. I mean, it's incredible that it's actually managed to do this, renewable energy, when it's been up against such a suffocating influence of the fossil fuel subsidies. So it's a great achievement what's happened with renewables, considering what it's been up against in terms of the price signal.
Absolutely. And so, in the last 10 years, the cost of electricity from solar PV has come down by 85%. For concentrating solar power at 68%, 58% for onshore wind, 48% for offshore wind. So as I mentioned, there's a template here. These are essentially small modular technologies, relatively low barriers to entry for manufacturing. When you do the support, you get these industrial and technology improvements, and it's a replicable process. So we can take what we learned there, and apply it. It's already happening for batteries and EVs, right? But for other technologies that we need in end uses like heat pumps, solar thermal, for space and hot water, process heat, hydrogen electrolyzers, etc. So there are lessons we can take there. We can identify which technologies are amenable to the same process and do that. And as you say, we've achieved all of this with a hand tied behind our back and probably one leg strapped up as well. And today, solar PV and onshore wind are undercutting new fossil fuels around the world, and even just the fuel costs. And that was before the recent price hikes. So the key learning here is that we have a template.
Yeah, fantastic, Michael. Stay with us. We're going to now introduce our second guest, and our second guest is Ivo Mulder, who's coming in from the Gulf region of the world. Ivo is head of the Climate Finance Unit at the UN Environment Programme. He's a Dutch national. Ivo is also lead author on the State of Finance for Nature report, which involved the UN Environment Programme, the World Economic Forum, the Economics of Land Degradation Initiative, and Vivid Economics. Ivo, we want you to talk about nature and nature-based solutions, how much we need money to support these. And we know the Paris Climate Agreement cannot be be met without actually looking after our nature and not only restoring it, but conserving it and actually enhancing it. So we need nature as much as we need the renewable energy. Give us a glimpse into the numbers, and then let's just reflect on whether the fossil fuel subsidies could be better spent in your world.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I mean, I think one staggering number, in my view, is that, as you said, Nick, nature can deliver 30% cost-effective solutions to tackle the climate crisis, but it's only receiving 3% of climate funding. I mean, this is not to say that the amount of climate funding to make the energy transition needs to be shifted towards nature. I mean, the absolute amounts need to be increased to accelerate the energy revolution, but the relative share of climate funding going towards nature basically needs to increase. Just to sort of explain also to the audience what are nature-based solutions, because a lot of people equate it with national parks, etc. I think what is important is that we need to put nature much more at the heart of how our economy works. That ranges from green rooftops and green spaces in cities to avoid this idea of heat islands, where heat is basically trapped and reduces the well-being of people, to storage capacity, to using mangroves against storm surges, for example, across coast. So it is about national parks, it is about reforestation, but it's also much broader. And this report that we published, the State of Finance for Nature, basically tried to quantify for the first time how much money is invested, but also how much money is needed if we are to successfully tackle the combined climate, nature, and land degradation targets. What it shows is that the current investments on an annual basis is around 130 billion, which sounds a lot, but it's a fraction of what the global GDP is. If you look at how much money is actually needed to successfully tackle the climate, nature, and land degradation crisis, the amounts of money need to increase at least fourfold from existing numbers. That is, of course, also against a background where countries are starting to rebuild their economies in the wake of COVID. And there is, of course, a risk also with potential rising interest rates that the fiscal bandwidth to do so will actually diminish. But while the UN and many others have been arguing to build back better, many governments do seem to build back as usual. A lot of the money that has been made available by governments around the world has been going towards so-called brown sectors. A very, very tiny part has been going towards sectors and activities that are basically beneficial for nature and climate. So what is even more interesting is that if you look at the difference between the richest nations, the G20, and poorer nations, non-G20 countries, is that it is more cost effective to invest in developing country, non-G20 countries. But 90% of current investment, mostly public funding, is going towards the richest nations. Basically, governments spending money in their country of origin. There's a tiny portion that is going towards ODA, official development assistance. And the amount of private finance is a sliver. It's a tiny fraction of what is actually needed. In a typical economy, the private sector makes up about 60% of GDP. In the case of spending on nature-based solutions, the private sector makes up about 11%. So that really has to increase. So while we can argue for governments to spend more domestically and through ODA, whether they will actually be able to do that in a changing fiscal space is doubtful. But what they could be doing, and what Michael has been arguing also in terms of shifting fossil fuel subsidies, is to create incentives for private financiers and for the traders, for agribusinesses to change and shift their practices, and that is possible. I mean, both the European Union, but also Korea have changed agricultural fiscal policies, providing support to diversify crops, for example. China has provided subsidies to reforest, and Switzerland provided the transition subsidy to move away from intensive livestock farming. So it is possible, but I would say one of the big takeaways is it is important for governments to increase the actual amount of money going towards nature-based solutions, both from a climate and nature perspective. But even more importantly is to create incentives for the private sector to change how they grow our food that we consume on a daily basis, how we invest the money that our pension funds are doing. A tiny fraction is going towards forestry, a tiny fraction is going to agriculture, for example. So those are the kinds of levers that a government have at their disposal to make that happen. And this is what we're trying to argue in this report.
Good, Eva. So just a quick question there. So on the fossil fuel subsidy story, I mean, the story of the fossil fuel subsidies is one of money being spent on something that is causing, environmental damage and could be better deployed. I mean, in a sense, we don't want to say that all the dollars of fossil fuels should go on one thing or another. There's a lot of choices out there. But what you might be implying, I think, from what you're saying, is that some of that money going on fossil fuel subsidies could be used as an incentive, seed money or incentive money for changes in, say, the way the private sector invests in nature or other kinds of operations, so that the money could be act as a catalyst for more investment in nature-based solutions, which we urgently need.
Yeah, correct. So basically, it will take time to make the energy transition a reality, at least up until the level where it's needed. Investing in nature-based solutions can be a quick win as an interim solution to make that happen. So a shift in fossil fuel subsidies, part of that revenue could be used not only to accelerate the energy revolution, but also invest in nature to go to, say, carbon net negative much quicker than is originally envisioned. Maybe also important to note, and building on your point, Nick, the IPCC came out with a special report on trying to achieve this 1.5 degree target, this trying to limit warming to 1.5 degrees above the industrial times. And in all these scenarios, investing in nature is extremely important. And so it is not an if, but how, basically, question.
Good. Let's stay with us, Eva and Michael. I'm going to introduce the wonderful Boaz Paldi here, who, as I mentioned earlier, is with UNDP, and he is very much instrumental in the launching and the viral nature of this campaign, Don't Choose Extinction, which UNDP is running, and which we're very proud to partner with. Boaz, give us a little sense of your of what you've heard from Michael and Ivo in respect to your thoughts.
Thanks very much, Nick. My reflections are that listening to Michael, it seems pretty obvious to me as a layman. I'm not an energy expert by any stretch of the imagination. That renewable energy is cheaper than fossil fuel subsidies. And the fossil fuel subsidy than fossil fuels. And so fossil fuel subsidies actually skew our economy towards fossil fuels rather than renewables. And that seems like an absurd situation that we find ourselves in as we're heading towards a disaster. So the idea that we could be using renewable energy in a much, much larger way in our economy is a no-brainer for any government to see and to incentivize, as Ivo and Michael said, to incentivize the private sector to move in that direction. And so it's an obvious choice. We have to stop skewing the economy towards fossil fuels and away from renewables and do exactly the opposite. We have to skew the economy towards renewables. And so give us a fighting chance. And then I reflect on what Ivo said. That fighting chance nature-based solutions has to be part of it. The idea that we have to protect all growth forests, the idea that we have to have green spaces within cities, the idea that the nature is part of the solution. I think many people looking at the climate agreement and looking at the process of climate change forget the nature part of it. And it's incredibly important to emphasize this, that reducing emissions alone is not going to get us to the 1.5 degrees that we all want to try and achieve. But only through a nature-based solutions, only through looking at nature can we actually achieve them. So I think that those are extremely valid points in these arguments. I'd like to just ask Michael, if I may, is it in fact, like, for laymen out there, is it in fact true that these days renewables are cheaper than fossil fuels?
Yeah, so absolutely, Boaz. So for most of the countries in the world today, depending on whether they have an excellent solar or wind resource, solar PV or onshore wind, if you have the right regulatory and institutional framework in place, will offer the cheapest source of new electricity generation. And increasingly, because costs have come down so much and we're in this low interest rate environment, although let's see, they're increasingly undercutting even the marginal operating costs only of a, let's say, an increasing share of particularly coal-fired power plants, which have quite high fixed costs, and also increasingly gas-fired power plants. And that analysis was all done prior to the recent 6 months price spike that we've seen. So, you know, when we're talking about the power generation sector, it really is in most cases a no-brainer. There are exceptions to this. We can't just make a blanket statement. But if you're talking about the G20, it is essentially true.
Thank you. And Ivo, if I may just ask you and just build on something that you said, how can we do that transfer? How can governments really take that money from fossil fuel subsidies and put it into a greener economy that includes nature-based solutions? What are practical steps that can be taken by governments, by policymakers, by people around the world?
Yeah, thanks, Boaz. I mean, I think the private sector operates on a very simple equation, which is stable, predictable revenues that can be discounted to the present situation. And at the moment, investing in nature yields a social outcome. It yields an ecological outcome in terms of capturing carbon, protecting biodiversity. It doesn't often yield a financial outcome. Or if it does, in terms of sustainable agriculture, it is subpar to, say, monoculture. So what can governments do is first of all, have a stable, predictable carbon price, including a price for, say, forest carbon, with ideally a minimum threshold beyond $5 per ton. So in other words, if you can't sell it, there is a fallback option where you can actually sell an X amount. So stable, predictable revenues related to ecosystem services, perhaps starting with forest carbon or blue carbon is one. Second, the energy revolution has been made possible through so-called blended finance, meaning capital made available at below market rates, feed-in tariffs, etc. That's virtually non-existing in nature-based solution space. It's starting to come, but it's extremely small. So especially the richest nations, Boaz, who can still borrow at extremely cheap rates, being the US and many countries in the EU, they could actually make government money available to crowd in private finance through guarantee schemes, through junior subordinate loans. And the third important means is changing trade and agricultural fiscal policies. So unlike fossil fuel subsidies that really need to be phased out, agricultural subsidies do have a place in terms of providing income to farmers, lifting them out of poverty. But there is a need for repurposing. So removing the most price distorting subsidies and really making sure that those subsidies are geared towards using existing land as opposed to clearing more tropical forests, for example, or using degraded land for production other than clearing native vegetation. So basically providing stable revenues through ecosystem services, starting with forest carbon. Second is concessional funding, crowd in the private finance. And third is fiscal and trade-related subsidies.
Can I just, sorry, Mike, we're not ignoring you. I just want to pick on one last thing that Ivo just said there, because Ivo, we're talking about fossil fuel subsidies and people think about fuels and things like that. But there are some products that also derive from the fossil fuel industry. I mean, the most obvious one being plastic. But I mean, fertilizers, the proportion of fertilizers and pesticides and herbicides that come from petroleum-based products. I mean, there's a whole debate about how useful these are to the environment, and sustainable agriculture or smart agriculture would probably foresee a reduction in the use of fertilizer, or a smarter use of fertilizer, a reduction in the use or a smarter use of other chemicals. But if fossil fuel subsidies are also, in a sense, helping those chemicals to be cheaper than maybe they otherwise would be, again, there's another lack of incentive to actually be smarter about your agriculture.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. I mean, I think what it shows, Nick, is how much fossil fuel subsidies are percolating into other sectors, including agriculture, through, for example, cheaper herbicides, pesticides, and fertilizers, and that it thereby indirectly incentivizes monoculture agriculture, for example. So yes, absolutely. I mean, I do think we need a radically different food system. But part of the solution is also changing actually fossil fuel subsidies. So I think that is a very interesting analogy that you're making.
Yeah. Michael, can I just come back to you? So we think about renewable energy, and obviously there are different kinds of renewable energy. There's new kinds of renewable energy coming through, breakthroughs and things like that. Again, is reallocating fossil fuel subsidies to R&D in renewable energy by governments, or other forms of renewable energy that haven't quite made it yet into a really commercial way, like say wave power or tidal power or whatever, other ways in which we could even ramp up faster all kinds of renewable energies if we could maybe allocate some of these fossil fuel subsidies?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely an issue, Nick, right? So the lost revenue that's typically coming from these fossil fuel subsidies, even in OECD countries, is non-trivial. And those funds, as you say, could be used to support the early stage of the development of the technologies that we're going to need to deploy in 5, 10, 15 years from now. So where, we need to already be thinking about, developing the innovation framework to support technologies that we're going to need in 2035, 2040, and 2045. So that, the lack of funding throughout, if you like, the chain required to support the introduction of new clean technologies is an important issue. So we need to scale up R&D funding, then you need to have the demonstration projects, and you need early phase support, right? So we're talking a lot these days, of course, with the dramatic fall in the cost of electricity from solar PV and onshore wind in particular, about the role of renewable hydrogen from electricity, green electricity, and electrolyzers. And there, again, there's a lot of deployment that needs to happen, scaling up of manufacturing processes, development of new, if you like, not new technologies entirely, but refining the existing ones to make them more efficient, to reduce the materials costs, to automate manufacturing lines. All of that needs to happen before we get the costs down. And so we need to repeat the process that we've done for solar PV and onshore wind in all of these areas. And we can't wait as long as we did for onshore wind and solar PV. It needs to be happening now because we're out of time. So, electrification is buying us time to get these technologies online, and we need the funding.
Yeah. I'd come back on one other point there, because there's something called the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction, which is also coordinated by UNEP out of Paris. And I see that buildings, for example, are stubbornly something like 40% or just under 40% of carbon emissions, and it's going to grow even more as the developing world increases the number of buildings they've got. And again, at the heart of that story is, yes, green roofs, Ivo, that's important too, but also, is how do we electrify the buildings and make sure the power to buildings is coming from clean green energy. And it just strikes me that the government, if you look at a lot of numbers on R&D and support, it tends to be going backwards by governments. They're spending less on all these kind of development things we need. But the building sector also needs money to electrify with clean energy. And yeah, just a comment on that, Michael.
Yeah, so no, absolutely. So I think I hopefully said in my remarks, sooner rather than later, right? We need to seriously address the end-use sectors. And buildings are very stubborn or problematic because in OECD countries, the building stock is very old and there's a very slow turnover. So we have a lot of very inefficient buildings built before the first oil crisis, which consume a lot of energy, fossil energy predominantly, natural gas or oil-fired heating and domestic hot water heating. And, so if we can electrify, if we can decarbonize our electricity, we're obviously addressing the existing electrical uses in buildings, like the lamp in front of me here, making sure I don't have half my face in shade. But it's the space heating and domestic hot water heating where we use fossil fuels. And we need to have an integrated approach. It's very challenging because there's so many more stakeholders involved, different ministries, from health and safety, obviously, to building, local regulations. So it's very challenging. We need to start early, not just on the technology side, but the policy support to ramp up programs, to replicate processes and the introduction of technologies, whether that's solar thermal hot water heating, heat pumps, bioenergy, sustainably sourced bioenergy. So very challenging and underappreciated.
Boaz, we're going to have to wrap up here, but I think this is a very interesting tale because actually these two people here represent, in a sense, to me, the core of the solution to climate change through, clean, green technologies and nature-based solutions that could both benefit from your wonderful campaign to bring down and hopefully one day phase out fossil fuel subsidies. Just a quick comment from you, Boaz. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think, these are the twin areas where we need to focus our energy on: renewable energy on one side, and nature-based solutions on the other side. And then there's a third pillar that we always have to remember, that we always have to protect the poorest, the disenfranchised, the poorest nations, that they don't fall behind in this decarbonization, in this moving towards a green economy, and we have to protect them. That's the third part of it that fossil fuel subsidy reform can address, because it can transfer that cash into people's hands in the form of social protection of some sort, but it can also do that in the form of green energy schemes and nature-based solution schemes. So I think that can also be part of that solution, and make sure that people are not left behind when we talk about these issues.
I think that's a very good point. And I think that what some people forget out there, who even know a lot about, say, renewable energy, is that they think the price of solar and wind is so low that it just happens automatically with the private sector. But there are a lot of things that need to go into parts of Africa which are still very expensive. Interconnectors that connect you to a grid or a grid at all. And to bring renewable energy in, I think you need those kinds of support for some of the least developed countries around the world. So yeah, I say ladies and gentlemen, actually, we don't have ladies on this particular show, but I promise you on the third episode, it will be very heavily female dominated. So we're looking forward to that. Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you so much, Ivo, for coming on this second episode of our Dino Talks. Thank you very much to UNDP and Boaz, my co-host here, for being available, and thank you to our Prime Computer, a partner of We Don't Have Time, who is supporting what we're doing with these 10 episodes. Thank you very much, and tune in to the third episode. Bye.
We believe by rewarding climate solutions and warning all the polluters, we will make it profitable to save our planet and super expensive to destroy it.
We must now zoom in on the quality and the implementation of plans, on measuring and analyzing, on reporting, transparency and accountability.
We want to be better, and that's why we are open for climate dialogue.
We want to know what you think, and so that we can improve.
Let's give climate love to those that have the solutions. And let's send climate warning to those that needs to change.
I invested in We Don't Have Time because I actually agree, we don't have time. we're trying to reduce CO2 collectively.
If we don't act urgently and quickly, catching up later won't work.
The drive to net zero is the growth story of the 21st century.
We had about $350 billion of direct subsidies and tax expenditures, tax breaks given to fossil fuels.
Have such an enormous mobilization of business, finance, civil society, and science all gathered here.
We have halved our own emissions between 2012 and 2017 and are now at the 70% reduction.
SSAB has decided to be the first steel company in the world to offer fossil-free steel to the market in just a few years.
There's lack of clarity and it just feeds greenwashing and delays meaningful action.
We just have to go quickly. We have the technology. We don't have to develop technology.
We're going to create this huge wealth transfer from energy producers, who represent a tiny minority of people, to energy consumers, who represent all people.
We are in a climate emergency and we are very far from where we need to be.
Get ahead of the curve or you're going to lose.
I was able to attend one demonstration that kicked off at Kelvin Grove all the way to George Square, and we had a lot of activists.
What I feel that I can bring is a young audience that maybe doesn't know what to think about climate change.
What is happening here, negotiating, it's so wrong from our perspective. You don't put a price on your mother.
Now, personally, I don't believe the fossil fuel industry should continue to be allowed to operate the way it's been operating for the last several decades.
We want to bring a voice to all the new solutions, the new ideas, the new entrepreneurs who are out there trying to kind of make a break and create this new climate economy.
They're setting a great example, and there's lots of other big businesses that should follow their example.
I really want to urge everybody just to be thinking more about land use and not just electrifying vehicles to, maintain the environment that got us here today.
They want to ban the word burgers, sausages, and steaks from being used on vegan and vegetarian products.
Tell them what they do so that they will be encouraged to do more. And together with the community or users, we share this to millions of people on social media, so this is getting noticed.
Let's bring in Shweta Chakrabarty tonight, risk and behavioral scientist and president of U.S. operations for We Don't Have Time.
As the name says, we don't have time.
ستوكهولم مؤسس منظمة ليس لدينا الوقت. We don't have time. السيد إنغمار رونسبورغ.
Joining us for more is We Don't Have Time's Nick Nuttall. Nick, welcome to the program.
And Nick, about this counter, speaking of numbers.
This is a clock that shows you how much money has been spent on fossil fuel subsidies since the beginning of the COP.
We have a climate crisis and we're still subsidizing the industry which is causing the crisis. I mean, it's completely dumb. I'm a finance guy, it makes no sense whatsoever.
$2.5 trillion went into subsidies for fossil fuel. That's a definition of insanity.
Still, this is a positive. It's the first COP decision that actually mentions coal power or fossil fuel subsidies.
We need to communicate climate action. Because if only a few people or a few companies are doing climate action without communicating it to others, we will not solve the climate crisis.